Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on catch up to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, your reaction to Britain's Next PM, the TV debate on Stoke-on-Trent between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. First, though, just a reminder that Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast are funded by subscribers to the Byline Times, our brilliant monthly newspaper. No one tells us what to say. We can report without fear or favour and hold the rich and powerful to account, because our funding comes from ordinary subscribers to the Byline Times. There's no oligarch or non-dom telling us what to say, so please subscribe if you can. Head over to bylinetimes.com for details of how to subscribe. That's at bylinetimes.com. And if you have already subscribed, thank you. Now, I should say that this edition of Byline Radio, the Byline Times podcast, is going to be a little bit different to normal. There's no expert. There's no witness to the events, as it were, other than you. So I'm going to try and get as many people on as we possibly can, giving me your reaction, your honest gut reaction, if you watch Sunak versus Truss on the television. I was surprised early on at how aggressive Rishi Sunak was. I did feel that Emily Maitlis needed to intervene a little bit more strongly, quite honestly, because Rishi Sunak was really, really heckling Liz Truss early on. But some of the policy differences, I thought, between the two were really laid bare. I thought particularly on the issue of climate change, which I have to say was covered in disappointingly small detail. Rishi Sunak made sensible suggestions, I thought, about energy efficiency and recycling. I mean, I think on their own, they're not necessarily going to tackle climate change. But Liz Truss, despite saying that she was a teenage eco-warrior, said that she didn't want to see ordinary households penalised, so she would drop the green energy levy, for example. So how she thinks we're going to fight climate change when we're not funding green energy, I really don't know. Clearly, she is still in thrall to Boris Johnson, and she said that, yes, he made mistakes, but I don't think they were sufficient to remove him as Prime Minister. So she's still hankering after Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak was obviously a little bit more cautious in his endorsement of the Prime Minister, given that he was one of the people who helped to remove him. But he did say that he deserves 10 out of 10 for delivering Brexit. So I was chatting to somebody while I was watching it, and they said to me, and they are, I suppose, somebody of the left, somebody who might well vote Labour. They said, I do hope Truss wins the Conservative Party leadership battle, because that would be good for Labour come the next election. I suppose there is that argument, but there is also the argument of, well, don't we all want the country to be as good as it possibly can be and to be governed by the most capable and competent person? Now, if that's your judgment, would Rishi Sunak not be rather a better choice than Liz Truss? I don't know. I'll throw it over to you. Jacko, by the way, on Twitter says it was a 0-0 draw. I'm not sure it was, actually. But as I say, I'm happy to throw out to you. So if you do want to join in the conversation, by all means, just request a microphone. If you're listening on a smartphone, in the bottom left hand of your screen, there will be a little microphone. You tap that to join in the conversation. You request access to the microphone, and I give it to you, and we have a chat. That's how it works. So this is a phone-in tonight. This is not going to be with an expert. This is just me chatting to you, and if you want to join in, please do. Just tap your microphone, request access to the microphone. You can make your comments, and we can have a conversation. That's the idea of it. All sorts of issues that they discuss. Tax was right at the heart of it. And it was very interesting to me that Sunak, he didn't feel overly scripted in the way that Liz Truss did. Liz Truss felt heavily scripted and she had her lines. But one of his key insights was that Liz Truss's idea of cutting tax at the moment, he believes, would stoke inflation. And she said that Sunak's ideas will lead to a contractionary budget. So Liz Truss very clearly saying that Sunak's attempts to pay down the national debt will lead to a recession. But he says that her proposal of cutting taxes will lead to a spiral of inflation. So who's requesting to chat now? Is this Duncan? I'm going to try and get you on, Duncan, in a moment. Where are you, Duncan? Are you there, Duncan? It will be in a moment, I'm pretty sure. So where is he? Duncan, tap your microphone to speak, my friend. You can join in then.
Okay.
Yeah, yes. There you are. Go on, Duncan.
You can hear me.
Yeah, go on, Duncan.
Okay.
Just to encourage people, because just to say, Duncan, a lot of people listen to the Twitter Spaces, Byline Radio, and we usually have a guest or two, and it's a listening exercise. Tonight, though, I want this to be as much as possible a joining in exercise, because I've watched it, but I'm really keen to hear what you think and what you're made of it. Go on, then. What's your thought, Duncan?
I thought that tactically, Sunak's rather sort of more aggressive approach didn't kind of bounced off Truss. Most viewers, most voters aren't going to analyse it as much on policy terms as we might. So to a certain extent, I was watching it with the policy issues zoned out in the background. She kind of appeared to me a bit, having stuttered a bit during the stages where there were more candidates in the race. She was a bit like the sort of football team in a tournament that's made it out of the group stage and is now in the knockout stage. And I thought his attempts, because he always had to try and be a bit aggressive, a bit disruptive, that it didn't really affect her at all. And I thought she won the debate in terms of Conservative voters, but by some considerable margin.
Well, that's a really interesting point. And Duncan, let me ask you, by the way, this is said in any kind of judgmental way, who would you normally vote for?
I'd normally vote Labour.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think you might be right. In terms of the audience of just under 200,000 people of Conservative voters, that is the constituency, bizarrely, for this election, I think you might be right. But as I say, I was watching with somebody who said, and they're I suppose a Labour or certainly a Lib Dem voter, never a Tory voter. They said that they thought it was great that Truss might win because it would be good for Labour or be good for the left. And I was kind of thinking, well, surely we should be judging this on what's good for the country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that would obviously be the ideal thing, but that's not really the issue in this election. It's the Conservatives are going to decide who they think is in their best interests. One thing that did strike me tonight that really jumped out at me is that if anyone in the Labour Party thinks that Truss is going to be a bit of a walkover, I saw enough tonight to be concerned that some people may be underestimating her. I'm old enough to remember when Thatcher arrived on the scene in the 70s, being stuffed in every debate in the House of Commons by Wilson and later Callaghan, and it's got that kind of. I think Labour's really got to analyse how she was dealing with things tonight. She wasn't thrown by anything. I thought she was very cool, and he was getting just a little bit shrill in how he responded to it. I'm just leaving policy issues aside because she's clearly. The difference between them, and I thought Sunak's mention of, if we are Conservatives and we're not for sound money, what are we? Is a kind of existential question for the Conservative Party. But she came across as a bit more like a sort of Reagan type and Trump type Republican, which was, you run up debt and you use that to pay for tax cuts. I'm not sure if she explained everything as much as possible, but Sunak it was almost a bit like a sort of traditional conservative monetarist sound money type person in Sunak against a much more sort of Republican, we'll talk the talk about this, but we'll run up enormous debts to provide tax cuts in order to, as Sunak said, provide the sugar rush just before the election.
I don't know about you, Duncan. I detected the hand of Boris Johnson behind Truss, in the sense that she had a go at him on the issues that we are led to understand were part of the dividing line between Sunak and Truss. Between Sunak and Johnson, in that Johnson, although he talks a conservative game and has proved himself to be quite a hard right politician. When it comes to public spending, it's clear that he's happy to do whatever it takes, in a sense, to kind of keep people happy at that particular time. I think Sunak's desire is to have a much tighter rein on the public finances. I think that's one of the reasons that he disagreed with Johnson. And Truss is, we can start paying down the COVID debts in 3 years' time. Now, there might actually be something in that. I think people will hear that. And she described that as a once-in-a-100-year event. I think actually we have these once-in-a-100-year events maybe every decade, in my experience of life. Well, there may be different types of event, but there's usually something, isn't there? Once a decade, let's say.
Yes.
But you can kind of see the sense in that, in a way.
To deal with that in order, I thought it's quite revealing that she'd said, in my discussions with Boris Johnson this week, blah, 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 blah. She's clearly very close to that. Close to that sort of Johnson approach. I've always thought the Conservatives will pay and make as many tax cuts as necessary in order for them to win the next election, whether it was Johnson or anyone who succeeded him, because that's his approach. And in terms of what she said about paying off the debt, it is one of those things where you pay off the debt in big numbers early, or if you smooth the payment of the debt over 100 years, as we have done before, from the Napoleonic Wars to the Second World War. We paid some of these debts over a longer period of time and smoothed off in terms of public finance, you smooth off the payment of the debt. You're not. That was kind of interesting, but also I think opens the door up, I would have hoped, to some of the more imaginative Labour people in the Treasury about how you fund public services in terms of investment, not in terms of your day-to-day spending, but how you smooth off, not over 25 or 30 years under PFI or whatever, but you try looking at it, how you pay for hospitals, pay for council, creating council services in terms of buildings, how you pay for that over a period of time, smoothed over a period of time. And I thought that was... I would have hoped Labour would have picked up on something like that. I see Tom Watson.
Although Duncan, what you're talking
hello,
Duncan.
Tom.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, what you're talking about, in a sense, is borrowing for growth.
Yes,
that is slightly different from what she was saying, though, isn't it? Because she was talking about borrowing effectively to pay off the debt, or borrowing we've already taken on and paying off the debt in a more staged way.
Yes,
but the idea of borrowing for growth seemed alien to both of them, really. I was just interested on that economic debate, by the way, Duncan.
Yeah.
Sunak was really keen to go at Truss on this, because the one authority that Truss has quoted in favour of her tax-cutting proposals, Sunak didn't mention him, but is Patrick Minford, who is a professor of economics, in Liverpool in the 1980s. The kind of
I remember him.
Yeah, the father of monetarism. So one of Thatcher's favourite economists. Now he is a believer in inverted commas sound money, and Sunak said that Minford, the one authority that she had quoted, was actually predicting that if her tax cuts were introduced, that would lead to an inflationary cycle of 7%. So
Well, for mortgages,
spreads
that would
economically, really.
translate into 10% payments. But of course, Minford was just was followed on the Chicago School of Economics. But I think the idea when voters are on a phone waiting to find out how long the ambulance is going to take, or if it's going to arrive, or if they're going to get an operation at the end of it, the idea that they're sitting discussing the balance between M1 money supply and M3 money supply is kind of I think that's kind of unrealistic.
Listen, Duncan.
Right.
Let me see if I've got this right. One of them, I don't know which one. One of them is the amount of money in the bank, and one
in
is
general circulation. Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, as he found out with QE in 2008, and this is how somebody like Gordon Brown could understand it very carefully. You're not putting money into general supply. You're putting it into a controlled environment. So you're not standing outside spraying your watering can into the street. What you've got is within a contained environment in your heating system. It's not going to go.
Well, you're shoring up the assets of the banks.
So I was trying to explain that in terms that I can understand. Right.
Duncan, stay there if you will. I'm very happy to bring you back in a bit, but I'm trying to get a few people on as well. I'm just really keen to just get a sense of what people made of this. Jasvir's with us. Hello, Jasvir.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. You're on Byline Radio. What do you want to say, Jasvir?
I watched the debate, and to be honest, nothing really kind of engaging in the sense that I think people have made up their minds already. What I really wanted to kind of share is, by that I mean you've got a side either with Truss or with Sunak. I doubt there's many people in the middle. But what I really wanted to kind of point out is concerns from some members of the British Sikh community regarding Rishi Sunak's ties with India. And his family have been seen to kind of fall in line with the Modi regime. I think it's quite well known that India is being run in a very fascist way right now. Now, over the last 5 years, there's also been an uptake in what a lot of the Sikh community feel is the targeting of Sikh activism via the hand of India in the UK. In fact, there was a series of raids in 2018 in London and the Midlands, which Indian media actually reported as being done because of quote unquote diplomatic pressure on British authorities. So there's a concern from British Sikhs that Sunak being in the seat will exacerbate the situation. There's quite a few more examples. I encourage people to check out the hashtag West Midlands 3, which was a very concerning case that nearly led to the extradition of 3 British Sikh men where they would have faced the death penalty out in India. And when it went to court, it was found that there was no substance behind the allegations against them. And Home Secretary Priti Patel was actually questioned as why she actually pushed for the extradition of these men, and she never answered questions on this. So there's a lot of concern there, and I just wanted to raise that with your listeners.
Yeah, Jasmine, why would Sunak in particular, though? I'm aware of the case that you've mentioned. Why would Sunak in particular, if he becomes Prime Minister, be of concern to you over this case?
So I'll happily relay. So I guess it's really to do with direct ties he has with his family to the Indian upper class elite. There was an incident where his father-in-law, I think about 4 years ago, as everyone has done in India, noted the increase in targeting of minorities. So his father-in-law made a quote where he said, "India is no longer a safe place for minority communities. So if you're not an upper caste Hindu," and from that, his company was directly targeted for deregulation by Modi's regime. Following that, by no coincidence, soon after Rishi Sunak's father-in-law was actually making a lot of comments praising Modi. He's never again made such comments against the Modi regime that's going on under the BJP party. And there's also
he kind of learned his lesson, and he kind of
he's fallen in line, hasn't he?
I will tell you, Jasvir, I was reading my newspaper, my Byline Times hard copy, as it were, and one of our reporters, the excellent C.J. Willman, who writes a lot about the issues pertaining to Islam in particular, CJ has been taken off Twitter in India, and the Indian government has suggested he's a terrorist just because he has asked questions about the Indian government and its behaviour towards minorities, raising exactly some of the issues that you have raised. But listen, I appreciate you joining in. Thank you very much indeed. We'll move on because, I reckon it's an important issue, but a lot of people want to join in as well. Thank you, Jasvir, and I'm sure people will follow up the hashtag if they're interested that you have mentioned. This is Adrian Goldberg. You're listening to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, to the Byline Times podcast, and we are funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times, that very brilliant newspaper that I was referring to. If you want to take out a subscription, head over to bylinetimes.com, and in so doing, you'll not only get the newspaper, but you'll be supporting our work here at Byline Radio and on the podcast. Let's say hello to Ewan. Hello, Ewan. Welcome along. You're right.
Hi there.
Yeah, nice to speak to you.
Yeah, I think it's bleak, to be honest. I think in terms of, as a young person from Scotland, first of all, being Scottish, it's kind of isolating because all of this is happening up where it's really, really inaccessible, especially because obviously only the Conservative Party vote. And as a young person, it's bleak watching our future be debated by two politicians who don't really seem to care about anything other than lining their own pockets and kind of fighting over who can cut the most tax in Fantasyland.
Well, what I thought, Ewan, and I've got 3 kids myself, and from that point of view, I have a real deep concern about the future. And I was chatting to some of my mates about what it's like to be a young person, and obviously the concern about climate change in particular, which is something that previous generations haven't had. And I thought the debate on dealing with climate change was pitifully weak. I felt that Sophie Rayworth should have done more to push the candidates on that, but I also felt that their answers on climate change were really weak. I don't know if that's a concern of yours as a young person, but as someone who's in charge of 3 young people, that does concern me. I mean, Sunak talked about energy efficiency and recycling, which are important, but they don't go to the heart of the big debates around climate change and the kind of campaigns by people like Just Stop Oil, for example. Truss, quoting that she was a teenage eco-warrior, her big idea is to drop the green levy from energy bills. So I don't know if you heard, you, a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, I spoke to John Nicholson, the SNP.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the incredible wealth of renewables that Scotland has got. Neither of them seem to be aware of that or even interested in debating it.
Yeah, no, I think it's just that they don't have an interest really in a lot of what kind of to do with Scotland. I agree 100% that everything they said on climate change was pretty pitiful. When you look at the news and you look at the media and you look at, we've had the warmest temperatures on record, and that really sends a message. And there was no kind of good response as to what government action can be taken in order to support against and to support for the fight for climate change. And again, young people are trying to push this. They've striked from schools. They've tried to do their best on social media to spread it. But all that's happening is ignorance, particularly from the UK government, who are focusing instead on how much money they can make instead of the real issues. And that's, I think, the main issue is that they're ignoring young people's voices on issues like climate change. I would say on issues like LGBT rights as well. As a gay young person, I'm seeing the kind of impact on trans people that we've seen in the 80s with gay people, this kind of section of terror against trans people, which is just disgraceful. And there's really nothing that's being done about it. Liz Truss is the one who refused to support, the reforms to GRA and just completely dropped them. And it's that kind of action, or that kind of inaction, that we will likely see towards LGBT plus people if she gets in charge. And Rishi Sunak has barely said anything about it, and as far as I know, has rarely voted on LGBT rights. So it's that kind of worst of two evils, especially for issues like climate change, like LGBT rights, like Scotland, for example, where again no conversation is given to Scotland, particularly the rise of independence, the looming potential independence referendum from Nicola Sturgeon next year. It's all being ignored for issues that are supposedly central, despite the fact that they only really impact the people in England, and particularly the people in London.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, it's only an hour, and it's only one of a number of debates. But I can't help but agree with you. I mean, I don't know whether you agree, but this applies, I would suggest, all across the United Kingdom at the moment. The view that the NHS is in a state of absolute crisis. Now, Liz Truss, and forgive me, but I'm sure listeners will correct me if I've got this wrong. Liz Truss said that she would scrap the national insurance increase that Rishi Sunak has introduced and is coming in. I think if it hasn't already come in, it's coming in very shortly. Now, that national insurance increase, in the first instance, is designed to fund the lag in the NHS, the shortage of cash in the NHS, to catch up with many of the operations and many of the procedures that couldn't be done because of COVID. After that, the idea is that money will go into social care. And if we can deal with social care, then that will take a lot of pressure off the NHS. And as I say, unless I'm missing something, Liz Truss is saying effectively, we are going to reduce funding for the NHS at a time when anybody who's had any dealings with the National Health Service will know that it is in a state of dire crisis.
And that's 100%. And I think that we see in NHS historically, but I think especially because of COVID and the backlogs that have been created, we see the massive mess that has been left by the Conservative government. But we also see how bad they are with handling money. When you look at the way that they've wasted money so often with PPE that they just never used and it expired, with the COVID loans that were seen to be frauds that will likely never be paid back. The money that they are raising through the national insurance hike is just to fill back the holes that they wasted money on during COVID and even before that. So I think that the issue is, not only is that going to then decrease the amount of money the NHS have that's already barely there, it's not even like it's going to raise any money. It's just going to fill the holes that have already been left by the reckless spending of the Conservative government that really has seemed to go nowhere, because we're still underfunding so many areas. We still see issues in education and the NHS all over the place, and we're not really seeing any kind of change from that.
Ewan, stay there. Go on, Duncan. Did you want to say something else, my friend? Go on. Come back in if you want.
No, just listening. It's interesting getting a sort of perspective from Scotland. I've obviously not been there for many years, so the political landscape has changed somewhat. But in terms of what Truss was, I couldn't quite make out, because I was kind of blocking out the policy noise. Because they're in this very and the reason for that is because they're talking about appealing to 160,000 people who are actually going to be voting for them and not general voters. So they're trying to kind of push the buttons with the people who will vote for them, most of them next week, because although there's 6 debates that are planned, the key ones are this week and are the ones taking place this week, because the voting papers start dropping on doorsteps from Monday onwards. And I wasn't quite sure what Truss was, how they were going to how they're going to pay for things, and honestly, I don't think they know. Apart from them, some of them demanding 20% cuts across the board in every department of government, I'm not sure how they either create enough money or produce enough money through taxation, but they can't do it. If Truss is talking about lowering taxes, including corporation tax, or not allowing it to rise, where they get the money from when they're also committed to big cuts across every department of government, that just doesn't work. That's two things clashing with each other totally. But cutting taxes and somehow raising, as Sunak said, raising money to protect the NHS, none of them none of them will give granular detail of how they're going to do that department by department.
No. Although, in fairness to Sunak, I think at least he acknowledged the NHS. I felt that he had a kind of closer grasp of day-to-day politics, I suppose, or had his antennae closer to the ground. But just to remind people, if you're listening on Byline Radio, if you're listening live, if you want to join in, there's a little microphone icon if you're listening on your smartphone in the bottom left hand of your screen, and you can join in. Just tap the microphone, request access, and all be well, I'll let you on. I wanted to come back to Ewan as well about the kind of the nationalist dimension of this, Ewan, because of course the BBC went to great efforts to screen this debate in Stoke-on-Trent, which is, of course, a traditionally English Labour voting town, very working class area.
BNP voting town at one point.
Not in the
12 BNP councillors.
Duncan, please. Please. I mean, I don't think they ever voted a BNP MP.
Not an MP, no. They had 12 BNP councillors.
Yeah, they did. Anyway,
yes.
All right. Okay, I take your point. But my point is that it's a former Labour working class town which has voted Conservative, got a couple of Tory MPs now in Stoke-on-Trent. And it's part of this kind of famous blue wall in England and Wales. But Scotland is apart from that. And the electorate for this, Ewan, is essentially South-East England. That's the stronghold of the Conservative Party. Now, there are Scottish Conservatives, of course, and those Scottish Conservatives will get the chance to vote in this election. But they are a tiny minority within the Conservative Party, which I guess just amplifies that sense of alienation of Scottish voters from the whole Westminster process.
100%. I mean, to be honest, it's a common theme. I think that's the case, and that's why you're seeing the unrest, and you've seen the unrest in Scotland for a while. It is a common theme that Scotland are not listened to and are ignored and are seen as a small part of the UK. You see it everywhere you go, but I think this is a fantastic example. It is very, as you were saying, this England-centric. And as you say, Scottish Conservatives, there's not as many of them because the SNP has a very strong hold on Scotland, and we've not voted majority Conservative in a long while, and yet we're still getting fed Conservative leader after Conservative leader that isn't really doing anything but for themselves and for small parts of England when they talk about levelling up, and only come to Scotland for photo shoots when they really want to. And I think that's the issue, is that Scotland is being ignored continuously, and again, this is a fantastic example, and that is why Scotland is feeling so unrest, and watching it again and watching it and the reactions of the leaders and talking about different points, it is just really disappointing because there's no discussion, and there's really been little discussion on the future of Scotland and the union, not even on these debates or kind of, it's not been a centre focus when it should be a really important point, because the union is apparently a really important thing for the Conservatives, and it should be for the new leader. I myself support Scottish independence, and for me, I want to see the kind of the Rebellion and the kind of the discussion from Conservatives and from the potential new Conservative leader, but we're not really seeing that. We're not really seeing any discussion on union, any discussion on Scotland. Instead, we're seeing debates and discussion on things like Liz Truss's earrings or Rishi Sunak's dress sense. and I think honestly, when I was watching that, and I was thinking there are 10 times more important things like LGBT rights, like advancing that conversation on climate change further, or like Scotland, like, you know, young people, education, that isn't talking about Rishi Sunak going to a private school or Liz Truss going to a comprehensive. Those kind of things really irked me, because when you're watching it and you're watching them discuss nonsense things that are really unimportant when it comes to who's going to be the next leader of our country, to protect our country, to support Ukraine, all of these important points. And instead they're sitting there, or they're standing there talking about ridiculous talking points that are really nothing to do with what the next Prime Minister will need to focus on.
No, and in fairness, I think that issue of the earrings, which I think was sparked by a tweet made by Liz Truss supporter Nadine
Doris, yeah.
But it's like, again, Sophie Rayworth didn't have to include that, and there was reference to Rishi Sunak's £3,500 suit. As you say, the status of Northern Ireland, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was signed by this government, thereby implicating both Truss and Sunak, signed by their Prime Minister. And the one thing that Sunak gave Johnson 10 out of 10 for was securing Brexit. Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol is part of his Brexit deal. So Sunak gives that 10 out of 10. You've got Truss still hankering for him. And you think, well, OK, that jeopardises the position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. It's certainly created conflict and polarised Northern Ireland in a way that the Good Friday Agreement had kind of managed to enable people of different traditions to live more peacefully together. They seemed completely oblivious to that. Likewise, the Conservative and Unionist Party, as it is officially known, appearing to have zero interest, less interest in the fate of Scotland and its place in the Union than in Liz Truss's earrings.
Yeah. 100%. I think it is. It's just to watch these kinds of things and to watch them laughing about these trivial things when there are way more important things on the agenda that are really, really important for our country and for the, if they really want to protect the union and they really want to stop an independence referendum and all of this, then they really need to get a grip on the most important things. Nadine Dorries, as a cabinet secretary, no one else will ever hire her because she is utterly incompetent and useless. And the fact that she's still spouting her same nonsense is just unsurprising because she couldn't do a good job as a cabinet secretary. So now she's going to keep going on and on and on and on and spouting about useless things because that's what she was used to as cabinet secretary for culture and media. But hopefully we'll get more competent government ministers, keeping in the mess as a Conservative government we're going to have, so maybe that's not possible. But looking for some competent Conservative government ministers and cabinet who can take us through really difficult times. The cost of living crisis, the fact that so many people are facing tough decisions as before, whether to heat their homes or to eat and all of those things, and yet we're focusing and spending a lot of time talking about earrings. I think that just kind of I think that just kind of shows particularly the whole of the country where the priorities of some people are at, and particularly that the question was even asked. It's a bit odd.
Yeah. Go on, Duncan, go on.
Well, I thought, full disclosure here, my mum's from Donegal, so I've got a certain bias in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But it was interesting that although that issue pushes the buttons of Conservative members and voters, I didn't really notice it. Maybe it was part of the time when I'd actually turned the volume down just to watch it. It didn't really arise, and it's one thing I've had sort of talks with friends of mine who are actually in Belfast who are unionists to try and say to them, English nationalists don't really care about you. And in Scotland, English nationalists don't really care about Scotland. And it's what it didn't, and they're both coming hard behind the Northern Ireland Protocol legislation. Which is another thing where the sort of almost like heading straight down the tracks towards the EU Commission on a sort of collision course, but no one quite sure how that's going to play out. They don't, they don't actually care too much about the union that they assert that is so important to them. It's kind of lost on them that the Northern Ireland Protocol stuff it just didn't arise because for most of the English nationalist members of the Conservative Party are predominantly in the south and southeast. They don't care about Northern Ireland or Scotland, so they're not going to look for a long-term solution to it. In terms of GDP growth, I looked at some of the statistics information today. GDP will always be growing in London and the southeast because that is the area of the country where most investment is taking place, and that includes public investment. You have a sort of sound monetary policy type Conservative voter, perhaps outside London now, but certainly in southeast and east of England, home counties area, who are actually benefiting from Keynesian economics, which is the amount of investment going into my area. London, there was one point where you couldn't walk through London without falling through a hole in the ground where a new underground station was being built or rebuilt. And there hasn't been that amount of investment elsewhere in the country, and that includes Scotland. There've been the rest of the country has watched whilst London, the southeast, has grown in GDP terms and in terms of public investment in ways that other parts of the country have been totally starved of.
Duncan, I know this only too well. Living as I do in Birmingham, we look in envy at something like Crossrail. In Birmingham, we've had one tram network, one tram line since, I think, 2004. In the last few weeks, ahead of the Commonwealth Games, they've managed to extend the tram by about 1 mile through Birmingham city centre. That's it. I kid you not. That's it. Compare that.
Duncan, stay there. Nothing in comparison to what's happening in London, the southeast. Nothing at all.
I know it. Let's bring in Peter Jukes, executive editor of the Byline Times, co-founder of the Byline Times as well. I should say as well, by the way, our colleague Sam Bright has written about this in his brilliant book, Fortress London: Why We Need to Save the Country from Its Capital. This is not an anti-London thing, but it is it's pro the levelling up agenda that the government says it has, but on which it has delivered precious little so far. Peter, hello, welcome along.
Yeah, Peter, proud Armenian Welsh Londoner. It is a tragedy. I mean, I live in Southwark. I see cranes everywhere. I see investment. I see upgrading of things. This is a town that voted to remain, and the towns that voted to leave are, I'm talking about Brexit here, which is a key part of the problem, are the ones that are suffering. This is horrible to me. I mean, I don't want to live in a country where these huge divisions. I remember the 80s when in London, central Birmingham was better, even with the bull ring. These divisions caused crime, caused constant social tension on the street, caused distress. And it is I've got to say, it's one of those paradoxes of Brexit. I mean, Carol Cadwallader, before she started on her journey, the Observer journalist into Cambridge Analytica and Russian interference, I think she went to Ebervale, I think it was, which was massively voted, 70% for leave, and noticed all the infrastructure that built by the EU. And at some point, that we've got to turn around, and I hope the people who are, suffering, turn around to the politicians who lied to them. Because oddly enough, the metropolitan areas, which were mainly Remain, whether this is the north or the south or the west, have fared relatively okay. They haven't shrunk. Actually, Northern Ireland, growth-wise, has done as well as London. What does that tell you? Northern Ireland is not particularly, it's because it's in the customs union. And we ultimately, through this leadership contest, the thing they won't ever, myth, they cannot deny, their origin myth is that Brexit is great. And these disparities, which already existed, have been aggravated. And it's such a tragedy that the areas which voted leave, because they were being left behind, because the inequalities and the asset speculation in our economy, which goes to property, goes to city centres, goes to these metropolitan centres, felt left behind. So they pressed this big red button of leave, say, don't leave us behind. And what happens? They get even more left behind. It's horrible.
Peter, stay there. Be good to have you on. I did say at the top of this, we don't have an expert with us, but you can be our standing expert tonight. Let's have it here from Edu. Hello, Edu. How you doing? You're right.
Hi.
Go on, Edu.
Yes. It's all good, yeah.
You're right.
I just want to mention something like, I don't want to be branded as a conspiracy, okay? But I feel like we're going to be on the same boat because Sunak and Truss, they are on the same boat with WEF. So I'm a bit skeptical. What do you guys think?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, Edu. What
You know the World Economy Forum, Liz Truss and Sunak, they are both part of it, as was Boris Johnson. So I don't know which gain or how different they would be compared to how we were before, because the gain is the same.
The World Economy Forum thing, it's Duncan, Edu, sorry. It's become a bit of a kind of conspiracy theory. I must admit, I'm all for investigating conspiracies. I started with as journalist of the phone hacking trial, which was a criminal conspiracy, and I've seen other ones. The World Economic Forum is just a talking shop. It's like saying Davos. I can see the connections with Liz Truss and right-wing American groups, the American Heritage. I can see it with this book that she wrote, that they all wrote, Britannia Unchained, about the low wage, or rather the deregulated economy. I'm not sure the World Economic Forum means, it's like saying they're at the UN almost to me. But, it just seems to me that, many people turn up to this event.
Yeah. And Peter, if people are looking at practical differences between these two rivals, of course, people might argue that the overarching game of neoliberalism is still the only economic game in town. And it's arguably a game that Keir Starmer buys into as well. I know that many of his critics on the Labour left would make that claim against him. But in terms of practical differences within the framework that we operate in at the moment in the UK, there were clear economic differences and choices being offered by Truss and Sunak. Truss profoundly tax cutting, going into this world of even cutting back on the national insurance rise, which, as I mentioned earlier, the national insurance rise, isn't that the national insurance rise which is designed to fund the backlog in NHS operations? I think I must be missing something that no commentators appear to have pointed this out. If we slash the national insurance, remove the national insurance rise that Sunak has introduced, then what happens to waiting lists in hospitals? What then happens to social care, which is the next phase for which these national insurance rises will be used? Now, it seems to me that there is a very clear material difference between the offer being made by Truss and the offer being made by Sunak.
The problem is tax is always about how the tax burden falls and on whom, and who is most likely to cut their spending. Because that's the thing, you tax middle income or lower income people, they stop spending, and that shrinks the economy. You tax higher earners, you're basically taxing people who are saving anyway. And I am struck by this language of the credit card. We're borrowing 10 million here, we've got to pay it off over. We don't want our children, the burden to fall on our children, so we've got to pay it off now. Economies don't work like your own credit card. We've seen 400 billion in the last 2 years pumped out in quantitative easing by the Bank of England to the banks, who then lend it. They get a very low interest rate, they lend it out. And they tend to be lending out on speculative assets, not on production. That if the thing about, about how you spend those taxes. If you spend 200 billion or 30 billion, test and trace, completely wasted as far as I can see, useless test and trace. Germans did it for 1 billion. Or was it 16 billion on PPE, half of which we didn't work? That unproductive money goes nowhere. But if you invest billions in infrastructure and growing the economy, suddenly the growth of the economy makes that debt very small. So we're having it's not even neoliberalist. It's kind of a barbaric argument about tax and spend. What matters is the government is borrowing in order to create productive potential in the economy. That money spent by the government increases the productivity of the economy. When we had austerity, this was a really interesting fact. They thought for every £1 of public spending they cut, they would lose 70p for the private economy. Because the reality is, public spending doesn't crowd out the private economy. If a council worker or an NHS nurse is paid £1, they spend that money in the real economy. They buy pizzas, they get a taxi, they pay their mortgage, whatever it is, right? So increases the overall spend. And they thought for every £1 they cut in 2010, they'd lose 70p in the private economy. They discovered actually they lose £1.60. That's the IMF discovered. And we mustn't think of it as a zero-sum game between public spending, doctors, nurses, firemen, teachers, and the private economy, because every public sector employee is paid spends in the private economy. It's where that money is spent, and is it growing everything? At the moment, they have no idea of how to grow the economy, how to create a green economy, any other it's just merely selling to 160,000 Conservative voters who are mainly probably upper middle class or middle class, who look at their savings, who want to reduce their tax burden. That is not leadership. That's not thinking about the country. That's not thinking about our children, which is not the worry about having a huge debt. It's the worry the economy hasn't grown.
You're listening to Peter Jukes. Peter is the executive editor and the co-founder of the Byline Times. And this is Byline Radio, or if you're listening on catch up to the Byline Times podcast, reporting without fear or favour. If you want to support our work, please take out a subscription to the brilliant monthly newspaper, the Byline Times, edited by our colleague Hardeep Mathari. You'll get details of how to subscribe at our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's at bylinetimes.com. I'm Adrian Goldberg, and we're just chewing over the Rishi Sunak versus Liz Truss debate, the first of several ahead of their election by their peers in the Conservative Party. Not the peers of the Conservative Party, by the way, not the lords and ladies, but just by ordinary members of the Tory Party, 160,000 odd of them, who will be voting for the country's next prime minister. We might talk about that as well, Peter. There's a kind of the oddity, the odd quirk of a democracy that allows 162,000 people to select a leader for 67 million of us. But let's bring in introspective.
I just wanted to come in and say, I'm really off the back of what Peter was saying on the economic front. It very much feels like we're living through a giant sunk cost fallacy, especially in context of the mission for freeports, which both candidates are doubling down upon. I'm not sure how much that's being driven by external interests. Obviously, it's a flagship capitalist experiment for places like the IEA and Shankar Singham, who was quite involved in the whole plan for Brexit. But it does.
The IEA being the Institute for Economic Affairs.
Yes, Institute of Economic Affairs, one of the primary think tanks. And I actually live in Teesside, so I'm within that big 45k circle that they've got there. So we're very interested to see what degree of rights erosion, with Truss talking about a full fat Freeport.
Well, Sunak. Or was it? It was Sunak, wasn't it? He was talking about the Freeport in Teesside, where you are, which I struggle as somebody who doesn't live anywhere near a port, being in the middle of the country in Birmingham. Do you know how it works? It's a low tax area.
Yeah.
work?
It's essentially in keeping with the sort of radical deregulation aims that they have been pushing all along. It allows primarily tax concessions around corporation tax, around employers' national insurance. None of it trickles down. Well, to the extent that there's integrity among the firms that produce the inwards investment. I mean, typically internationally, it's been areas where people have stored assets away from scrutiny. But it also comes with weakened, likely, worker rights, environmental rights. I mean, in Teesside right now, we have a massive issue with die-off of sea life because they have been dredging the ports, which was predictably going to be an issue with a lot of heavy industry and chemical manufacture for sort of over the last 180 odd years here. And it's been catastrophic, and there seems to be no appetite to investigate that. And that, I think, lack of recourse to redress it is rather a lot Sunak's baby. He wrote a big paper about it back in the day, and could well have been instrumental in him getting his role as Chancellor. That lack of recourse to redress, that lack of ability to get scrutiny and get some kind of compensation or investigation, I think is probably indicative of where it might go.
Yeah, I mean, its baldest terms, a free port, I read, is a special kind of port where normal tax and customs rules do not apply. So I suppose the economic argument is that it would be attractive in terms of inward investment. You might get people coming into the country who will pay less tax, but who will be situated in your country rather than in another country. That's the principle behind it, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a sort of a contradictory position with it as well, where the boundaries will apply. So you don't have, you effectively create internal borders in the UK, and all the other patches around the country as well may have competing different levels of deregulation and tax advantages. So there's very little economic evidence. Obviously, free ports were attempted here back in the day, and I think they were cancelled in 2012. That you couldn't create the same advantages with effective inwards investment that was focused on creating good jobs, creating local infrastructure, exactly as Peter said, creating productive things in the area, as opposed to what feels like just having Amazon distribution kind of jobs, Uber kind of jobs, where there is no effective protection and trickle down. And I mean, obviously trickle down economics has its own issues. It's been roundly debunked that money does come down if you make the wealthy wealthier without improving equity. But yeah, so that was just what I wanted to say.
No, listen, thank you for that. Peter, you were about to make a point as well. It's an interesting discussion about free ports, but you're going to make the point, Peter, I think, about Sam Bright at Byline Times discovering that you don't even have to be based in the UK or a UK elector eligible to vote in this country in order to vote in the Conservative Party election.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They haven't replied to us. We've discovered this a bit like the Charter Cities free ports thing. We have reported on the free ports thing, which is a recipe for money laundering and illegality, but more of that anon. And I'm just, it is, the weird thing is somebody spoke eloquently when I joined, in terms of Northern Ireland and Scotland, we have rampant English nationalism. And I went to Northern Ireland, spoke to people in Dublin, Belfast, even the Unionists saying we're more scared of London now than Dublin because rampant English nationalism. But embedded in English nationalism is this post-imperial global nabob culture where we are just creating these hyper-globalized, regulation-free Singapore and Thames structures. And the Conservative Party embodies this. It pretends to represent, as Boris Johnson does, with his immigrant background, interesting, this Englishness, which is actually, as we know, he had a lot of Russian oligarch friends, deeply, as Theresa May might say, citizens of nowhere. And, I think this is the weird thing, that we're getting this managed democracy that midway through every Conservative administration, as Theresa May or David Cameron, now Boris Johnson, seems to be losing public prestige, we have a managed election, like an internal election, for 160,000 people. And I think unless this is stopped now, unless whoever succeeds Boris Johnson, this will be the way the governing party will see how to manage elections. You get Prime Minister elected by the Conservative Party, they go to the country, they get a vote or not, and then the Conservative Party gets rid of it midway. And to emphasise your point, we don't know if those electors are English or British at all.
Indeed. Peter, stay there. Let's bring in Tony Yates, who wants to join the conversation. Hello, Tony.
Hi, thanks for inviting me on.
Welcome. Go on.
I just wanted to make a couple of points, firstly about freeports, and then secondly about the tax cuts that the two candidates were debating. So on freeports, I mean, the frustrating thing is about them, even that they're touted as a benefit of Brexit. Of course, we could have had freeports and did have them at various times, without leaving the EU. So it's sort of a fake benefit of Brexit.
Yeah.
The second thing about them is that they're not really a benefit. So what research has been done into them has shown that all they do is displace activity from one place to another, and they don't generate a net increase in activity in the country that hosts them. What they are is a sort of enclave, a carve-out in the UK single market so that stuff can be imported and then without crossing the UK regulatory border can go back out again. And that's how, that's the sense in which they're free. So you have a sort of enclave of non-UK customs, regulation.
I mean, presumably they are regulated to some degree. I mean, the UK would have, if you like, freeport regulations, albeit that they will differ from the regulations in the rest of the country. There'll be lower taxes, for example, I'm imagining.
But they could do. It's not. They don't necessarily have to be like that, but they could do. Obviously, anyone in the border has to respect other UK laws. So, you can't shoot people inside the free port or, rob each other, things like that.
Yes.
The main thing is that nothing in the free port crosses into the UK single market. And that's why, they don't have to pay customs. And that's why they're not subject to other customs and other checks. But they're not a good thing. It's not a good economic policy. It's one of the silliest ideas that they've pursued. I mean,
we should say, Tony, that your Twitter handle describes you as a former economics professor, so you're not just making this up, as it were. But all of the Tory candidates that I've heard are wedded to this Freeport idea. It seems to be one of these big ideas that Conservatives, anyway, have embraced. I remember in the 1980s, again, these throwbacks to Thatcherism, parts of the country that had been absolutely wiped out by Thatcherite economics, really. I think of Dudley in the Black Country, where the Round Oak Steelworks closed, for example, and there will be many other parts of the country to which this applies as well, post-industrial areas, where there were enterprise zones set up with government incentives, reduced taxes there, I think, as well. Is this equivalent to that?
I'm more in favour of that, because that doesn't introduce this sort of patchwork exemptions from, UK customs and other product standards. So particularly, and then you can obviously direct them at particularly deprived areas, and perhaps encourage lots of businesses to relocate there. There's not we don't have a great record of success at this kind of policy, but other countries have done it with more efficacy than we have.
In an enterprise zone, you might offer, a holiday on business rates for a number of years, or the government might reclaim contaminated land so that it could then be used afresh, rejuvenated brownfield sites and so on. So the government primes these sites and makes it attractive for businesses to move in. But once they have moved in, and hopefully then moved into profit, they obey the same rules and regulations as everybody else in the economy, unlike free ports.
And the companies are part of the UK integrated economy with free ports. What the companies are doing are importing stuff and then re-exporting it. So they're not embedding themselves in the wider business community in the same way. The other thing I wanted to mention was about the tax cuts. So, there's a clear difference opened up between the two candidates, Liz Truss promising essentially a tax cut or, cancelling tax rises, and Sunak arguing that that's not a good thing to do. I mean, both of them are wrong, really, but I suppose Sunak is closer to the position that I would adopt in that, the thing the main thing we're facing are huge burdens on our fiscal capacity, mainly to try and resolve the crisis in NHS and social care. So this is not the time to cut taxes. And secondly, to offer people help with difficulties over the cost of living crisis. And cutting taxes is not a very good way to do that because it's not well targeted enough. So they're expensive, and that's better done with benefits directed at the very poor. But at the same time, he's wrong to characterise doing it as, potentially sending us into a fiscal crisis or prompting a massive increase in interest rates and then a recession afterwards. I mean, Liz Truss was right to characterise that as Project Fear. Mm. But then she's also wrong to say that somehow a tax cut would turbocharge growth to the extent that it would actually save money and not spend it. So they were both talking nonsense, really. It's a great shame. Anyway, that was my main point I wanted to make.
Says a professor of economics, what do you know? Tony, thank you. It's really good to have your expertise. Thanks very much indeed. We do get some great people joining in on Byline Radio. Thank you for that. Obviously, my comments, Tony, were tongue-in-cheek about your expertise. Of course, you are an expert. Shergill joins us. Hello, Shergill. Welcome.
Thank you for giving me the mic to speak and ask a question, if I may. And that is this, that, so I kind of have some finance background and belong to the finance world. And what we are seeing is a very, very deep recession coming globally. And therefore, everybody is, sort of preparing for that. So from a UK politics perspective, if we don't have elections soon, the Conservatives will likely lose big because they would just be at the receiving end of all the, sadness the UK public would experience because of the recession, and therefore, surely the government should be thinking of, sort of a more longer term policy of how to keep the economy moving within UK.
To what extent, though, I suppose the question is, will the British, if there is a recession like this, will the British public be fairly blaming the Conservative Party? To what extent is this pain that I think many people are already experiencing and that will they experience? To what extent will that be the responsibility of the Conservative Party?
Well, all of it, pretty much, because they gave lots of money and to some extent wasted a lot of money during COVID, where, people's nephews and nieces were on furloughs. Whereas when the money is needed now, we don't have the money, and people are going through sort of interest rate rises, quantitative tightening, etc., etc. So the government it's government policy, right? So surely the Conservatives, as such, both whether it's Sunak or Truss, would be on the sort of a losing battle. I'm not saying that Labour are the alternative to go. Everybody says, "Oh yeah, let's go Labour." It's just the ruling party would be suffering given what's happening in the economy.
Yeah, I suppose the question that's interesting to explore intellectually is if there is a global recession, some of that is clearly out with the control of the Conservative Party in the UK, isn't it? I mean, clearly the invasion of Ukraine is not their responsibility. Brexit, on the other hand, clearly is. And I think most objective commentators would see that as being a significant drag on the economy at the moment.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's bring in Guy. Thank you, Shergill. Guy, hello. Welcome, Guy. You're on Byline Radio.
Hiya.
Yeah, welcome, Guy. Yeah, go on.
Do you guys in here believe in freedom of speech?
Well, within reason, Guy. You frighten me when you ask a question like that at the start of a conversation.
Well, I just, my personal opinion is that Truss isn't capable to lead the country, and many women aren't, and that men are far more adept to lead the country.
Oh, I see. That's that kind of freedom of speech, rather sort of being stupid guy. Yeah, okay. Well, we won't let you speak any further then, because that would be daft, wouldn't it? Let me bring back Peter Jukes. Peter, I thought Churchill raised an interesting point about the question of, if we're going to face a global recession, clearly there are aspects of this which are out with the Conservative Party's control, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a prime example of that. But we also have to then look at its own performance, and it's so insightful, really, to look at how Truss and Sunak are pulling lumps off each other, really, in relation to the country's economic performance, which they are both, to an extent, responsible for. I mean, Sunak more so than Truss, because he's been the Chancellor, but it's as though the Tories haven't been in power since 2010.
Yeah, that's my fear, is this sense of fake change, that we have an internal party election like the Politburo, and everything's changed because these people are responsible in government for, was it now 12 years, are nothing to do with it. It definitely, look, there is no doubt there's a global recession. There was COVID impact, and now we have particularly energy prices and restraint of trade, wheat, potential famine in across the world because Ukraine's a major bread basket. But there's also no doubt, if you look at the relative performance, we're bottom of the OECD, I think the 12 or whatever, along with Russia. So we, as Adam Posen, the former member of the Monetary Committee of the Bank of England, been on Byline TV a lot, I think it's written for us, he says, Britain's the only country in the world that declared a trade war against itself. The gravity of our closest partners, we see these cues in Dover. We've been documenting them on Byline TV for over a year, but now COVID's over, or it's not over, but now people feel they can move. We're seeing the symptoms of that, and so all I'd say about that, you're too young. You're spring chicken, Adrian. But I can remember the 70s. I can remember stagflation. When now we're hitting something mixture of stagflation and stag affluence. By the way, is that the whole world suffered the oil price shock of the OPEC embargo after the Yom Kippur War in 1972. But Britain was the sick man of Europe, and it only really recovered its relative backwardness. I remember traveling to Europe in the 70s, amazed, traveling to America. Everybody had a better lifestyle than we did. And now we won't notice it. We're lagging behind. And until they face the fact that a hard Brexit is catastrophic for the country, we could leave the EU and be like Norway. We could be a member of a customs union. We could do all these other things. The shibboleth of the macho that we left the EU in the most abrupt terms basically means we leave the top European economies. It'll take a while, but we have inflicted this damage on ourselves. And the Conservative Party, and at the moment the Labour Party, because they don't want to relitigate Brexit, are incapable of addressing that thing which has wounded us more than any other nation in Europe.
Ewan wants to make a comment. Hello, Ewan. Welcome back.
Hi. Yeah, I think another point I think that's important to look at as well with their policies is the Rwanda policy. I think that's been a talking point for a long time, and we now look at news articles recently. They've said that it's cost £120 million for 200 people now, instead of the original quoted up to 1,000. And now they want to continue this policy, despite interventions from the European Court of Human Rights. At one point, some were suggesting we leave the European Court of Human Rights, who are no longer in the leadership debate, which would be catastrophic for things like the Good Friday Agreement. But I think that's a really important point as well on the Rwanda and the fact that both of them want to push this policy further, despite the fact that it is inhumane and the issues, particularly for LGBT people and other minorities who would face further difficulties in Rwanda. and the fact that we're not finding a better way to look at it. Although all the leadership challenge want to do is just continue this barbaric policy, despite the fact that we're already wasting £120 million on it for 200 people.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I do feel so passionately on this subject. I mean, Peter and I are both of migrant stock, both of refugee stock. And this is one of the most disgusting policies
100%
ever implemented by a British politician. It absolutely stinks. Not only does it stink morally and ethically, it's also woefully ineffective. I think there's been a report presented today, forgive me, either in the Commons or the Lords, just talking about how ineffective it is. It is pure dog whistle politics. It's designed to generate headlines in the Daily Mail, and the Daily Mail, of course, or the Mail on Sunday yesterday saying, Truss, I'd send more migrants to Africa. Really? Where's the revulsion? Where's the outrage? Where's the honour amongst politicians, whether they're Conservatives or of other parties, to say this is no way to treat or to talk about other human beings? This is utterly despicable. Utterly despicable.
Adrian, we know that from all the facts that 70% of these migrants have genuine asylum cases, like your father did, like my grandfather did. And worse than the fact that there are these talented people like your father, like my grandfather, who'd come and enrich this country and be so grateful to it. This is pure National Front rhetoric from the 70s. Do you remember? You don't. I do. Earlier,
of course I do. Of course I do.
Send them back to Africa. Yeah. It's a repatriation of people to the wrong country, of course, because some of them are Afghans, but there's protections for Ukrainians and Afghans on there. But let's not also forget, and we've got reporters going out there to document this, Rwanda had the biggest genocide in living memory in the 90s. 1 million people were killed. It has massacres. It has no security for these people. And imagine that this is what Conservative candidates are brandishing. This is their red meat, and it is moving into National Front territory. I mean, it's not quite the same. We have people of colour, senior in the cabinet. We have them senior leadership contenders. But outside British citizenship status, they're willing to torment, send people to a third country. It's just, how did we get here, Adrian? I feel the same. How did we get here?
Tony wants to make another comment. Tony.
Thanks very much. 2 quick ones. Firstly, on the Rwanda policy, which I have to say is just absolutely unspeakably shameful. But aside from that, because I'm not a speaker on moral or ethics, it's also incredibly expensive. So I think that Rwanda have now said they'll take something like 200 people a year, and that would amount to a cost of something like £600,000 per person, which is, just a ridiculous thing to do with public money, aside from the cruelty that it inflicts. Anyway, but the other thing I wanted to say was about Brexit and, what we know about what it's doing at the moment. So, beforehand, economists thought that the sort of Brexit we chose, although we didn't quite anticipate how bad where things were going to end up, would cost about 4 to 5% of national income every year forever. And the evidence has come in pretty much online. I think that is pretty much what it's costing us. It's hard to tell, obviously, because we don't know what Britain would have looked like, had we not left the EU. But as far as we can tell, it's as bad as we expected. The 5% doesn't sound like a catastrophe. It sounds like just missing out on a small promotion or something. But if you think of that, each household missing out on that income every year of their lives and every year of their kids' lives and their grandkids' lives, it's a colossal amount of money capitalized into today's terms. It's absolutely enormous. But what worse, I think, is that it's in Labour feeling that they have to accommodate to it, and they may well be right about the electoral calculus. It's depressing to think that they might be. I feel that we've entered a world where we don't really talk about the evidence and the efficacy of policies anymore. We've entered a land where you can just make stuff up about, what you're going to do. And, one of the bees I have in my bonnet is the sort of utopian way that both parties talk about levelling up or industrial policy and regional policy, as though that we can pull these policy levers and somehow more than offset the costs of Brexit. And I just do not share that optimism at all.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Tony. Sergio, do you want to make another point? Yeah?
Yes, Byline, sorry for speaking too much, but just some context, and it's probably a question for Peter, which is since the start of the year, $33 trillion has been wiped out in terms of assets valuations because of the stock prices falling, etc., etc. In that context, would any party, whether that's the Lib Dems or Labour or any other political party, stand to take advantage if they were to play the let's even consider rejoining the European Union?
Peter, did you want to come back on that from Sergio?
I had this weird thing where it blocks off some other speakers. So can you just repeat? Can you just repeat the question? I sometimes get transcripts.
Just raising the issue of at some point requesting readmission to the European Union, whether that would ever be a feasible scenario.
Look, I mean, I was in the EU Parliament, which was much more interesting and much more dynamic than Nigel Farage ever described it for the first time about a month ago. Obviously, with the current use of Brexit, the Europeans wouldn't want us back. There's a tragic example. They're not releasing funds to science programs because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We have a government which is basically making Europe the enemy, and there's a short-term distrust of us. They would obviously, I think, because the overall benefit, accept a customs union and then a single market eventually. And then maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, a reformed UK, a UK which is not a post-imperial state, which has somehow found a way of dealing with itself, I think would be admitted. But, the Germans would welcome us back, but other nations wouldn't. It's not as simple. They have agency too. We've seriously disrupted the EU, and Nigel Farage claimed we'd derail the EU. All those Brexiteers say, well, the EU wouldn't exist in 5 years. 6 years on, especially with Ukraine, it's stronger than ever. So, we'd be lucky to be left back. I think in my lifetime, I'm 60, I hope within my lifetime we will be back. But our economies cannot separate in the way we're trying, and the force of gravity will draw us close to a single market, customs union, single market. That will happen.
Let's bring in Hannah. Hello, Hannah. Welcome to Byline Radio.
I was compelled to ask for the mic, and thank you very much. I don't know, it was a comment that Peter was making in regards to what are we going to do about the Rwandan situation, where are we going? What I wanted to say is it did not start with Rwanda. They tested the water, obviously, the Conservative, with the Windrush situation. There was no outcry about that. And it dragged on for long, and up to date, a lot of that situation has not been sorted out by the Conservative government. They said they're going to do it. Still, people are suffering. So if the Windrush situation has not been dealt with, and there was not much outcry, and it was there in the public domain for a while, and it just finished, sort of swept under the carpet. It's not at the forefront of any media or any newsletter at the moment. So for that case, I think they already know what's going to happen and how much pushback they're going to get from the public. And they've done that over and over and over, the Conservative governments. I'm not saying Labour does not have anything fault. If there was strong opposition, or any other party was strong opposition, maybe something would have changed in regards to all the mess that Conservative Party have done to the fabric of our nation. whether it's the Brexit fabrication of things, whether it's jeopardizing the Good Friday Agreement because of the Brexit, whether it's the Windrush situation, whether it's the cladding in Shepherd's Bush?
Grenfell Tower, you mean?
Yes, Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
It's been one thing after the other. Whether it's about lying to the Queen and closing the House of Parliament.
Oh, the prorogation of Parliament, yeah.
Exactly. So they've done a lot of things, and there's never been a strong pushback. I don't know. They've messed. They've been in power, but I'm not blaming totally the Conservative. I'm also blaming the other parties which have not been able to push back strongly.
No, well, it's an interesting point, and I guess behind this, Hannah, is an electoral calculation, and the calculation is that some people will oppose it. And they will be people, I suspect, who the Conservative Party feels that it can afford to offend, people who would never in a million years vote Conservative. And then there will be other people who it thinks it can bring on board to vote Conservative with that kind of, I've used the phrase already, dog whistle racism, really. I think Windrush was an example of that. And the vans that went round in Theresa May's time, warning people who were illegally in the UK that they'd better go, for fear of a border officer rapping on their door. And now we have the Rwanda situation, and the Conservatives obviously feel that it draws support to them that might otherwise go, I can only presume, to far-right parties. Maybe perhaps traditionally would have gone to UKIP, but UKIP's no longer an electoral threat to them, but it was for a time, which is perhaps how we got here in the first place. But I agree, it's very sad. It is very sad.
Adrian, just as a note of encouragement, the Australian government, you remember they had this island. This very much copied the Rwanda policy, apart from, I'm going to fail Godwin's law and mention Hitler and Zanzibar and Madagascar. But anyway, apart from that, the Australians had this island where they deported everybody to. And the Liberals, their Conservatives, ran this election very much on these lines of ousting foreigners, trans wars, culture wars, this red meat, and they lost. So I really don't think, it's not just from being in the bubble of Byline podcast and Byline Radio and Byline Times. I don't think the British people are like this. And if you look at the polls we've done, other people have thought, they're not caring about culture wars, free speech, and immigration is way down. It was very high in 2015 for reasons one day I'll go into, thanks to Nigel Farage and Vladimir Putin. But, it's not high up on the list. So this is what they know to do. This animates the base. And the base in both sense of the words, the fundament of the Conservative Party UKIP element and the basis instincts of the nation, which is turning on others or is locking the doors behind you, pulling up the ladders. I don't think the British people are like this. And I think this rhetoric might get a Conservative leader elected by 160,000 people, but get them resoundingly defeated by the country.
I wish I could be as optimistic as you, Peter. What I do know is that those kind of dog whistles will be vociferously adopted and amplified by the Daily Mail, by the Telegraph, by the Sun, sometimes by the Times as well. And part of our mission at Byline is to expose these links between politicians and the media, and sometimes the dark forces that we don't see that are propelling them. But I've been through enough of these cycles in my lifetime, Peter, as you have, to fear that there is something within the British psyche as well, which periodically is drawn to these far-right tropes.
Yeah.
That worries me.
No, look, Adrian, I'm not naive about, I say the English people particularly, and any nation's capacity to become xenophobic, and especially when times get hard, and it happened in the 30s, turned to othering, to blame, to stab in the back mythology, to enemies within. But there is, on the papers, let's be very clear, they only survive now thanks to the VAT cut on their websites. We always forget that huge subsidy, which was Boris Johnson gifted to them, or Theresa May did effectively, and then the COVID bungs. Their circulation is declining. Obviously, the impact on the BBC. And I remember, maybe not talking to you, but some members of Byline Times team, 2019, Boris Johnson's going to be here forever. He's in for 2 terms. A year later, Dominic Cummings was out saying he was a trolley. 2 years after that, he's gone. Never give up hope.
That might be a good point at which to close our debate this evening, mightn't it? I think it's a suitably optimistic note, but thank you. And what I love about doing these conversations is that they roam so far and wide. We started off by talking about Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. We've had very erudite discussions about freeports, amongst other things, as part of this conversation, obviously relevant to the Sunak and Truss debate, but also a far greater depth than anything we saw on the BBC tonight, because, well, maybe because we don't have Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss in the room, I don't know. But listen, it's been great fun, and thank you, Peter. Thanks for joining in. It's been great to have you as a co-host for this, but thank you to everybody who's taken part as well. And just remember that all of our work on Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast is funded by subscribers to the Byline Times, which is a great newspaper in its own right, but also helps to support Byline Radio, the podcast, Byline TV as well, and our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's where you'll get details of how to subscribe as well at bylinetimes.com. Thanks everybody for joining in. If you've listened live on Byline Radio or listened again on the Byline Times podcast, we'll be with you again very soon. My name's Adrian Goldberg. Thanks for listening. Cheers for now.